And I'm going to start.
Good evening. I'm Leah Fox, Director of the Vance Wall Art Education Center at the Montclair Art Museum, and welcome to the 14th Annual Film Forum organized and sponsored by the African American Cultural Committee, or AACC. The AACC is an ever-growing group of dedicated artists, community leaders, and volunteers who have been engaged in the life of MAM for over 40 years. I'd like to take a moment to thank all AACC members for their service to the Montclair Art Museum, and especially to Matilda Williams and Joya McRae of the AACC Programming Committee for organizing this evening's event. For more information about the AACC, I will share their webpage and email address in the chat several times during tonight's event. I also invite you to follow them on Facebook at African American Cultural Committee at Montclair Art Museum. I hope you all had the opportunity to watch the film that will be discussed tonight, Colored Frames from 2007. I will save the honor of introducing tonight's moderator and speakers for the chair of the African American Cultural Committee, but want to express a deep appreciation to them for sharing their vision, talent, and personal stories. I also want to thank the MAM staff involved in producing tonight's event, Edward Chang, our educational technologist, and Catherine Pezzo, our education assistant for diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. I want to extend a special welcome to the museum members who are tuning in. If you're not yet a member of the museum, I want to personally invite you to join the museum family. Member benefits include free admission to the museum galleries, which are in fact now open to the public, discounted classes and programs, and more. More information can be found on the museum website, montclairartmuseum.org. We invite you to visit the museum to view two exhibitions that just opened at the beginning of this month. Fragile Freedoms, Maggie Miners revisits Rockwell, and New York to New Mexico, New Acquisitions. Before we begin tonight's program, I want to remind you all that you're invited to share questions and comments for the panelists using the Q&A feature. In addition, closed captioning is provided, and you can access that through the live transcript closed caption icon at the bottom of your screen. Now, I will turn it over to the chair of the African American Cultural Committee, William Jigetz.
Thank you, Leah. I appreciate that. And thank you all who are attending. And I want to especially reiterate the thanks to the African American Cultural Committee and our Programming Committee who have worked so hard to bring this program together. Before I do the introductions, I just want to say a word about the African American Cultural Committee and the Montclair Art Museum. Right now, a lot of most cultural organizations around the country and around the world are scrambling, if you would, to achieve some cultural relevance and catch up in terms of African-American art, African-American and Black participation. The Montclair Art Museum, as Leah stated, has been doing this for 40 years. The African American Cultural Committee has had a 4-decade relationship, a productive and amicable relationship with the museum. So I want to thank the committee founders, Ben Jones, Janet Taylor Pickett, and Valerie Wilson Wesley, all of whom are very much still active and still working and doing great things. And I want to thank the museum's current and past administration for being so responsive to the art and artists, African-American art and artists, and the African-American community in and around Montclair. For this evening's program, our panel consists of 3 illustrious artists I'm sure you're familiar with, but I'm going to do the introductions anyway. Ms. Robin Holder is a recipient of several residencies, grants, and awards from the state of New York Council of the Arts, from the Brooklyn Arts Council, Manhattan Graphic Center, the Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation, Printmaking Workshop, and Brooklyn Cable Access Television. Her works are included in significant collections, private and public, including the Library of Congress, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and she also has completed 5 large-scale site-specific public art commissions for the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the School Construction Authority, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the Connecticut State Arts Commission, and the New Jersey Transit. Ms. Holder has worked in arts and arts education with over 15 cultural and arts organizations throughout her career in Delaware, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. Curly Holton has been the director of the David C. Driscoll Center at the University of Maryland since 2012. And he is the professor of art emeritus at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. Curly Holton is a printmaker, a master printmaker, and a painter whose work has been exhibited professionally for over 25 years in more than 31 one-person shows and 85 group shows. His exhibitions have included the Egypt's 7th International Biennial, the Cleveland Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and his work is also in many private and public collections, including the Yale University Art Gallery, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts Gallery, and the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. He is also the founding director of the Experimental Printmaking Institute. Also, we have with us today Adger Cowens, a fine arts photographer and abstract expressionist painter. His works have been shown by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the International Museum of Photography, the Museum of Modern Art, the Studio Museum of Harlem, the Cleveland Museum of Art, and the Harvard Fine Arts Museum. He attended the Ohio University, as well as the School of Motion Pictures and the School of Visual Arts in New York. Adger Cowens has been awarded the Lorenzo il Magnifico alla Carrera in recognition of a distinguished career at the 2001 Florence Biennale of Contemporary Art. Those are our panelists this evening. Our moderator is Dr. Halima Taha. Halima is an art professional whose curatorial, art advisory, and appraisal, strategic planning, and professional services develop corporate, academic, and civic programs and audiences. She is best known for her groundbreaking bestseller, Collecting African American Art, Works on Paper and Canvas, which is the first book to validate collecting fine art in printmaking and photography by African American artists. Her work has provided the foundation in conjunction with the National Black Fine Art Show for cultivating and educating the market that enabled the Swan Gallery to successfully establish the first African American auction category in 2008. It was also the catalyst for the major museums to pursue collections of African American art for exhibitions worldwide within the last 20 years. This work provided a solid market criteria for publishers to print more artists and collections independent of museum shows within the first 2 decades of the 21st century. So with that, I will turn this over now to our moderator, Dr. Halima Taha.
Good evening. I first want to say thank you for the title of doctor, but I am not a doctor. I do not have a doctorate, but I appreciate that. That's very nice for you to say, based on my work.
Did I just make that up?
Yes, you did. It's okay. It's all love. But on behalf of our panelists, Adra Cowan, Curly Holton, and Robin Holder, I would like to thank William Getz, Matilda Williams, and Joya McCrae from the AACC African American Cultural Committee and their members, as well as the MAM team for inviting all of us to contribute to this annual film series panel. I would like to begin by providing a context for the 2007 film, Colored Frames. This film was directed by a young filmmaker, Lerone D. Wilson, who interviewed artists within 5 generations, various stages of their careers and artist practice, including Adra Cowens, who's on our panel, Ed Clark, Benny Andrews, Howard Dina Pindell, Wangechi Mutu, Tafa, Diane Smith, Nanette Carter, Danny Simmons, Ann Tanksley, Francois Dessous, Gordon James, John Ashford, and Gustave Blanc. In addition to 2 art professionals, Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell, who at the time of the film was the Dean of the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. And prior to that, she was the Commissioner of the Department of Cultural Affairs in New York City, as well as the former director of the Studio Museum in Harlem. And Linda Good Bryant, a museum professional, curator, activist, and founder of Just Above Midtown, which was one of the first New York galleries featuring African American artists, in addition to one of New Jersey's beloved collectors and art advocates, Ronald Alley. Collectively, these interviews dispersed with images made by many of the artists featured focused on the frustration among these artists and art professionals with the way institutional racism, which I am defining as prejudices and biases against Black people that have been integrated into legislation to impose an intellectual and social apartheid through Jim Crow laws to uphold segregation of public places and spaces, specifically to this film, museums and galleries. These biases have roots in the justification for enslaving Africans as only being good for childbearing and labor because they were viewed as unintelligent human beasts of burden. As such, these biases were carried over to misperceptions about the intellectual capacity of artists of African descent, whereby they were pigeonholed to not being able to produce meritorious work or narratives that particularized the Black experience to a universal connection to humanity. For example, in 1867, the New York Herald stated that the Negro seems to have an appreciation of art while being manifestly unable to produce it. This statement of ability has influenced the perception of value and has both historically and systematically marginalized and minimized the social economic worth of African American people and artists in the United States. And currently, despite the increased interest in Black visual culture as evidenced in sales, exhibitions, auctions, African American art history courses, and publications. The influential weight of opinions from cultural arbiters outside of Black communities continue to stunt the accurate assessment of value for the breadth of artistic wealth, aesthetic range, and the intellectual prowess of American artists of African descent. Now, the film was released 1 year before the debut of Swan Auction Galleries, which created the first African American auction category. After bearing witness to the success of Jocelyn Wainwright's annual National Black Fine Art Show, which was the first art fair in the United States dedicated to fine art presented by art dealers representing artists of African descent from throughout the world. This took place at the Puck Building on Lafayette Street in New York City and ran from 1997 to 2008, which was the same year Swan had its first African American auction in conjunction with the National Black Fine Art Show. A year after the National Black Fine Art Show, the first book to validate collecting African American art as viable assets and commodities in the marketplace was released, called Collecting African American Artworks on Paper and Canvas, which included painting, printing, and printmaking and photography. The process of finding a publisher was identical to fine artists trying to secure art galleries, in which the prevalent belief was that Black people do not buy art, white people do not buy art by Black people, in which they coined the term Black art, and Black people do not read. These views continue to be expressed as recent as 28 years ago. By the time this film was released, most American museum gift shops were selling Collecting African American Artworks on Paper and Canvas, and a wave of private collections of African American art were being identified and exhibited at various museums, which cultivated the impetus for what many of us currently are reading about in terms of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, about museums and commercial galleries hiring African American curators and dealers. So now I would like to be transparent about the way I'd like to see the panel go. I'd like to ask the panel a series of questions. The first question has a three-part answer in this first question. And I would like to start with Robin. And all of you, I'd like you to think about in this question, this three-part question. What medium do you work in? I would like you to share this with those who are just becoming familiar with you. What medium do you work in as an artist? And what is it about that medium that is so compelling to you? And then, what ideas and experiences shape your artistic practice? And how does it impact the way you see the world? And the third part of that question is, how does the world at large, and the art world in particular, impact your practice? Robin?
I see I have to be unmuted. Okay, I'm combining a number of different approaches to working on paper. So I'm painting, drawing, making prints, including some digital manipulation in my work, and collaging. And the reason I'm doing that is the way that I can realize the imagery that I am really obsessed with. Every time I work on a series, I have to really revisit what media and techniques I'll use, because that has to be compatible with the kind of imagery that I'm working with. There's something very intimate about working with paper and any application of paint, collaging, and drawing that can be produced on paper. So that's pretty much where I am right now. My work is very driven by my perspective of the world around me, which is kind of including a universal global view, a view of society and history and culture, from a standpoint of being a biracial interethnic person who lived for a number of years outside of the United States, which, by the way, was the time when I really was able to realize what my Americanness was, because I was running around Latin America and Europe talking about being an African American. They just said, no, you're an American, you know, you have a sense of entitlement, you have a sense of empowerment, and as a woman, you don't function like most women in the world. So my understanding of how I navigate society and my life and my professional activity really is very much informed by this dual perception. I'm pretty much using issues of social equity and social justice in most of my work, and have been for about 25 years now. It's a matter for me of juxtaposing people's humanity and their access or lack thereof of resources. And most of my work is somehow centered in personal histories that I gather from people, or my own experiences, or things that I become aware of by traveling. And I think that they are, from the response that I get from people that look at the work, they're universal issues. Halima, you're muted.
Thank you. Curly, would you share what medium you work in as an artist, and what is it about that medium that's compelling to you? What ideas and experiences are shaping your artistic practice, and how does that impact the way you see the world? And how does the world at large, and the art world in particular, impact your practice?
Well, I'm known as a printmaker primarily, although I've always painted and did a lot of graphic work, drawings. But printmaking became important to me as a discovery. I was introduced to printmaking as a form of sharing my art with the community. This was during the apartheid period, and artists were asked to create images that could be used to raise funds for the ANC. So I was introduced to printmaking through that process and fell in love with it. So the motives for me as a printmaker in that particular medium are probably three elements to it. Number one is it's the most democratic form of art making, in that you create it with the anticipation that you're doing multiples and that you're sharing it with a larger group. The second is the physicality of it, is that I came from a tradition of labor, and that labor was important, hard work, and what you make with your hands was very important in my family. So the labor aspect of printmaking, and I'm sure Robin can attest to this also, is there's a direct relationship between the physicality of printmaking, the press, the pressure, the materials, the transformation of materials. The material is a metaphor. The compression, the pressure that creates something that is unique and different than what went into it. So I see it as a great metaphor for life as a human, actually, and also a metaphor for my own kind of reality. So it has an intimacy for me. The other part of that printmaking medium is that it's communal. When I first met Robin, for example, was at Bob Blackburn's printmaking workshop, and you had all these artists, all these printmakers working at the same moment in a space. And so there was this community, this family, this relationship. So printmaking has always been a vehicle for me to connect with others, other artists from Latin America, Asia, Africa. And that motive was not just to share the medium, but to share aesthetics and language and strategies and arguments, artistic arguments that then broaden my own language. So that's my medium, primarily my choice of medium. Now, my motives, perhaps, as an artist, is kind of introspective. I do a lot of work about my own development and evolution. For example, I do a continual series of self-portraits, and I'm documenting my demise from being a young man and high school to the point I am right now. So it's interesting to look at these changes and transformations. So I'm actually painting and drawing myself out of the world. But what it allows me to do is to think about who I am and how I have become this, how I've arrived here, what am I, and why am I as I am. So this introspection is very important to me, and it's very private. What does happen is I don't have a lot of commercial interest in my work because it's so introspective. I'm not making popular subject matter. I'm not making so much comments on cultural life or my identity as an African American. That of course finds its way into it, but that's not my primary motive. So making my work in an environment that allows me to reflect on my own self and improve myself, to become conscious. And I'm fortunate to be an artist because it's an instrument that allows you to become self-illuminated. And that is my goal, to become as conscious of the world and myself as I can. And my art is my tool to achieve that. So in the marketplace realities, it's a little different. It's not so public. Actually, I don't care that much whether anybody even comes into the studio and sees the work, to be honest with you. That's not a primary for me. Now, how I counter that though, is by being a master printmaker that has created workshops, Experimental Printmaking Institute and Raven Editions, because in the collaboration, you become public, you become social, you become engaged. So I'm allowed to have this dichotomy of self, this private self and this public self. In terms of the art world, relationship to the art world and how it informs me, that's a tough one. I look for artists and works by artists that tell their story. I look for art that I call smart art, not just an expression of aesthetics or politics of the day, but a question. I look for an argument in work. Argument is very important to me. What is the motives in the work? What is the conviction in the work? So I look for that in the art world. When I see it, it is a great model for me. I see it in the work, for example, of Sam Gilliam. I saw it in the work of Benny Andrews and how he thought about his work. Great conviction, and not predicated on whether the world, the art world, was paying any attention, because that's, for me, that's secondary or not important at all, actually, to be honest with you.
Thank you, Curly, thank you. Adger, could you talk a little bit about the various mediums that you work in as a photographer, a painter, and a sculptor, and what's so compelling to you about all three of those mediums, and what ideas and experiences have shaped your artistic practice, and how does it impact the way you see the world, as well as how the world at large and the art world in particular have impacted your practice?
Well, that's a lot. I think that I started taking pictures when photography was considered a hobby. It wasn't an art. It was an art, but the art world at large didn't see photography as art. But for me, the idea of photography was capturing that moment on film that allowed somebody else to see into what I saw. In other words, I see myself as a translator between the spirit world and the so-called reality world. And I think that for me, that's everything, whether I'm working with photography or painting or printmaking or sculpture, whatever. It's always about making that image that spirit moves you to make. I don't necessarily decide that I'm going to do this or that. I wait until something happens. Like I tell my students, you don't take pictures with your eyes, you take pictures with your heart. It's a feeling, you know. I don't go out on the street and decide, well, I'm going to shoot this or shoot that. I go out in the street and I hunt and I wait until something happens and touches me. And I feel that, and then I press the shutter, you see. It's the same with painting. You know, looking at a black a blank canvas can be very, very daunting. What are you going to do? Well, if you have an idea, that's good too. You can start here, but may not end up there, you know. And the practice of all these things is something that I have to do. It's not something I decided that I wanted to do to become an artist. It grabbed me. It was something that was undeniable. I didn't want to be a doctor or a lawyer or any of those other things. I really didn't want to be anything. I didn't have any idea about being anything, but I was open to everything. And I think nature had a lot to do in terms of inspiring me, you know. And I like all the artists, every artist that I met. I like Da Vinci, I like Michelangelo, Kandinsky, everybody. I think in terms of my first influence, in terms of getting into photography, I used to ride around with Roosevelt Carter, who was in my hometown when I was in high school. And what he did was he was a stringer, and he had a radio, two-way radio, and they would call him, he'd go to a fire or somebody drowned in the river, whatever. And I thought that was interesting, you know, the life of traveling and going and being. So that was interesting to me, but it really didn't dawn upon me for a very long time that I was doing something called art. I just enjoyed taking pictures. So everything inspired me. I was very much inspired by nature. I was very inspired very much by my family, because I had people in my family to me who were very heroic in the fact that they lived their life and did great things. You know, my cousin Earl Sherrard flew with Benjamin O. Davis during the Second World War. He came home with all these, I thought that was great. And in my family, it was like, what are you going to do, boy? You're not going to sit around here and do nothing. You have to do something, you know? And so I was pushed, so to speak, into this. I had to express something. And that expression came through spirit to me. My art is all about making space in my work for people to exist. You see, it's not about me. I'm a translator. And if I felt it, I felt that somebody else in seeing it would have a feeling about it too. So that's kind of, you know, now how the world sees that. The only way I can say that is people call me and they tell me they like this or they like that. My daughter looks at some of my work and says, oh, Daddy, I like that. Can I have that? My brother comes to my studio and says, I'm going to take this. It's yours, but you can get it anytime you want to, but it's over here. It's the relationship with the people that's important to me. And that relationship with the people, you know, for me is what it's about. It's not about being famous. Being famous is a trick. You know, if you're getting there and you're famous, you got a problem. Because the art is what it's about. All of it, every bit of it is, and you have to remain very, what do I say? You have to be clear and clean in your spirit. What enters you, what you eat, what you think, how you move, all that is very important. Because as Black people, we move through the world different than anybody else. You know, look at Obama. When Obama became president, he walked out there that first, everybody was going crazy because he had that walk. He had that walk of the brother of the people. That's a feeling, you see. And that's always what I'm after in my work, a feeling that other people can identify with and have space to have their own experience.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all three of you. I felt it was extremely important for everyone who's joining us to hear from you about your work, how you approach it, how you feel about what you're doing, and also to understand what's behind your own personal philosophy and conviction. Now, I just would like in the second question to ask each of you to comment on a couple of aspects from the film and some of the issues that were raised in this 2007 film, and things that occurred to you, contrast them to what you see has remained the same or what has dramatically changed in today's market and interest in Black visual culture. and to just share your perspectives as artists and educators. Robin?
Yeah, it's you know, the film was made in 2007 and showcases a particular combination of artists who have very specific experiences. Certainly the rage and the historic, systemic, institutional racism is something we all struggle with, and that is still very apparent. In addition, we have so many aspects of our culture as African Americans in the United States being commercialized and stolen from us, which is another really painful, enraging component of it. And I think that everything that the artists who were featured in the film experienced, we're all, as we know many of them anyway, we're very aware of that, but things have changed. The things that concern me the most really have to do with the fact that now we're in the 21st century and we have less communal platforms for artists to get together, to gather, to exchange. One thing that has to be acknowledged and said very clearly is that being an artist is painful. And it's something you do because you can't do anything else. You have to do it. It's an obsession. It's a motivation that's beyond your decision making. You live it. And when you are making art, you are completely stripping yourself and you're making yourself vulnerable. At the same time that you're hopefully experimenting and having an adventure that you may not be able to actually predict the results. So this is something where it takes a lot of stamina, it takes a lot of conviction, it takes a lot of courage to make art, to be creative. That is probably very opposed to the marketing of the art and the dissemination of the art in our culture. Because the people that are the gatekeepers want to have a predictable product that they can talk about, that they can publicize, that they can market. If we are really on point and really centered in our creativity, we're trying to allow ourselves to be as spontaneous as we can be, which is not predictable. So those are the kinds of things that concern me about the making of art and the dissemination of art right now. The lack of vehicles for artists who are younger and middle-aged artists and elder artists to gather and collect and share stories and encourage each other. It is so minimal now, and I think that that is a very, it's a very concerning and it's a very painful thing.
Thank you. Curly?
Yeah, you know, it's Robin raises a real important issue, a number of issues. For me, I think about artists or this challenge in three ways. You have the artistic practice, what an artist does in their studio, their conviction, their knowledge about their craft, and what they do with it, what they choose to speak about. Not just learning how to play an instrument, but what song are you going to sing? What are you going to talk about? So when I first met Robin, I met someone at the workshop, and that was, I think, in 1989, who was absolutely devoted to her practice. There was no question about her devotion and commitment, her seriousness, her professionalism. I have never seen that change. So I saw an individual that influenced me. Robin influenced me in her work ethic, her commitment to her practice. In the case of Adger, I met Adger when I was a student at undergraduate school. I was the one that picked him up to bring him to the campus. And here I am meeting this famous photographer. I mean, think about it, this is over 30 years ago and he was famous. You're talking about the films he worked on, Old Golden Pond with the Fondas, James Bond's movies, just all the work he had did that had separated him. So here I am encountering these artists that were achieving and successful. Although I went to the Cleveland Institute of Art and there was only one slim catalog in the library by an artist of color, and that was Elizabeth Catlett. That is it, as if we didn't exist. Although Huey Lee Smith had attended the Cleveland Institute of Art, but there was no record of his publications or exhibitions in that library. My point I'm trying to make is that we are influenced by the success of others. And one of my concerns about the film is that some of those issues clearly were present, but have been transformed in many different ways. Even in 2006 or when they were making the film, there were artists that had significant success in spite of the barriers. And that's one of the problems that I had with it, is that it didn't speak of that so clearly. It didn't reveal that so clearly. Now, we didn't have a Mark Bradford. We didn't have a Kerry James Marshall at that time with the major success they had. But these artists were practicing and dedicated to their practice, and many of them had success. Benny Andrews was not a failure. Benny Andrews was a very successful artist, although his career did span a period of protest, the Artist Collective, a whole range of things. But these artists were still successful. And I used to tell Sam Gilliam this when he complained that he wasn't getting the prices of de Kooning or Jasper Johns. He would get pissed off about that. And I would say, well, Sam, you know, any white boy in America would like to switch careers with you. What are you talking about? You know, so there's degrees of success and accessibility. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that some of those issues in the film are not present, but we are negotiating those issues differently. So I think one important aspect is the influences we have. Robin influenced me, Bob Blackburn, Adja influenced me. We don't talk about influences enough and those legacies and that connection. That's really important to me. And also what we're not talking about too much is how we have negotiated these barriers in this territory. We have been skillful at surviving this, like no other group, ethnic group probably in the world has survived the slings and arrows of disrepute that we have faced. But still, we create great art, great members of our community, and we keep going forward. So this is an ability for survival and transformation. And I think that does connect to Adja's reference to spirituality, that we take, you know, the throwaway and we turn it into precious objects.
Thank you, Curly. Adja, please add to this.
I put him on the spot. I dated him.
He has passed the ball.
Well, I think all of that, you know, is important. I think that's why I was one of the founding members of Kamonge, you know, and now we have a big show that's traveling all over. It's at the Whitney now, and it's going to the Getty, and it started in Virginia. I think having younger people around and influencing them, and they influence you also. And I think Kamonge was like that. You know, we came together because we wanted to do beautiful pictures, not just that, but also photograph beautiful pictures of our people, you know. And I felt that it was important to, first of all, exchange with these people my information and knowledge, because I got out of school in 1958, which was a rare thing at that time for a Black person to have a degree in photography. So I shared a lot of my information, and we came together and formed Kamonge. I joined AfriCobra because I liked the fact of us working together. I wasn't necessarily the realist that they were, but the aesthetic that they, you know, talked about was important to me. And so I think that those kinds of things and those kinds of organizations, we need more of that to pass that stuff on. As far as the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, I personally,
Shakespeare on you,
you know, working with Gordon imparted one important message to me And that was to take negative energy and turn it into positive work. You know, he said, look, Jax, you know, you can be angry about what somebody did and you walk around with it all day. He said, that's a lot of energy. Just take that energy and make something with it. You have to transform. So me, my life has been about transforming all these kinds of things. When I got in the union as a photographer on movies, I was the first African-American to get in there. And when I went on the set, I mean, I can't tell you the negative energy that I got from all these white people because I was the only Black person. And I had an important job to do. You see, I would walk on the set and they say, what do you want? What do you do? I said, I'm the photographer. They said, oh, you're Edgar. I said, Adger. They said, oh, yeah, okay, Edgar.
Right.
And they would crack these so-called Black jokes, you know, and expect me to laugh, you know. It was very, very difficult because, but I just remembered what Gordon says, you know, laugh through it all. And I'm a person that rejection is a bad thing. I can't deal with rejection. So I decided instead of dealing with all of this, I would take this energy and go into my little studio or go into my little place and talk to whoever, the spirits, and create this work. To me, creating the work was the most important thing and still is. It doesn't matter what they do to me over there. In fact, I said at one point, thank you, white people, for fucking with me. You allowed me to create this great body of work.
Sure. The metaphor, you know, how powerful the metaphor is.
Yes.
When you were talking, it made me think, and I don't want to get out of the sequence, out of the line, but
no. Please know that at this point, it's a conversation. You know, I wanted to just set the tone so this would happen. Please, there's no sequence anymore.
Adger did a series of photographs about water, where you could see bodies inside the water. I had never seen anything like that. It was really amazing to me because I was always intrigued by the power of a metaphor, how the metaphor stood for the things that we're trying to assert and bring into the world. Al Loving told me that once. He said, artists make things that don't exist. We argue for things that aren't present, that need to be present. Mm-hmm. So it's a driver in my work as well, to bring something forward that's not being discussed or articulated or even witnessed. So that water, those images still stay with me. Actually, I got a signed poster of yours with one of those water images. But yes, but that the power of a metaphor. You know, and Robin has talked about it in her work, the diversity of her ethnic background and speaking about it and bringing something forward. So there is a dialogue. I think that's what we're doing. And I think that's important.
Yes.
One thing that I think is really important that people understand is that it's specifically with Curly, Adger, and myself, because of the media that we work with, we know a lot about chemistry. Sure. We know a lot about physics, mathematics, literature, history, social sciences. All of that goes into our work. We read a lot, we listen to people a lot, we travel a lot, and all of that experience becomes a part of the expression that we make. In addition to that, the whole process of creating your own visual language, where somebody can see one of your works and say, oh, I know that Adger Collins made that. Oh, I know that so-and-so and that. It means that you've spent some time. And that's what I'm a little concerned about with some of the younger artists. They want to show their work before they've even had time to reflect upon it, before they've even figured out what they've done. Because I know for me, a lot of times I'm not really sure what I did until way after I've completed it. Mm-hmm. And that whole process of dealing on a spiritual level and an intellectual level and a physical level and an emotional level creates a psyche that's very integrated. So the way that we navigate the world and our family and our relationships and our careers is really multifaceted. I don't think that people really talk enough about that.
Robert, you raised a great issue for me is that one of the things that has happened with the contemporary art world, especially with young artists, is the availability of publications. When we were students or when we were being taught and trained, it was an understanding that after working many years in your craft, achieving a certain level of distinction, museum shows, other kinds of things that were occurring, then perhaps a publication, a major publication would come forward. Right now, we're seeing young artists that aren't even waiting for an institution to publish their work. They're publishing these books on their own work themselves. Sometimes the credit, there's an absence of care and critical evaluation of that book that's being produced. But this is something that has happened because the market is so hungry for these newly anointed Black artists to stand in and say that, you know, the institution is saying they're diverse or whatever their motives are, just to exploit the market. All these young artists are being drawn into that. And sometimes their practice, their craft is still immature and not well developed. And I watch it and I think it's distorting them and maybe even harming them, because later on, if that market whim changes, where are they?
Yeah, this is a really excellent point, because, you know, as all of you, I'm so happy that all of you are here, and I specifically wanted you to share your stories and your perspectives, because often with these panels, moderators tend to be over involved, and you don't get to hear from the artists what their perspectives and their experiences are. And as well as curators are asserting their intellectual prowess on the backs of artists, but what's behind it? What's the substance? And each and every one of you, the sum of your experiences and the history that you've witnessed and participated in, and the quality of the work, it has just made a great difference in all of the lives that have had the opportunity to experience each and every one of you, as well as your work. And to your point, Curly, this is one of the concerns that I have with regard to the art that's in the market, and as far as a lot of the younger artists who are getting a lot of attention, and it's for some of them, they're not ready for prime time, and they don't necessarily have a consistent practice. I have met and spoken to many of these artists when they're in grad school or undergraduate, and all they're focusing on is, how do I become successful? How do I make it? And you ask them, well, what's happening in the studio? And they don't have an answer. They're not working so that if you were to bring someone to the studio, there's enough work for more than one show. But a lot of their attitude is, let me get the gig for a show, and that's the way they look at it, and then they'll produce the art, which impacts the process, the creative process that's involved. And I have seen this, having been traveling to fairs prior to COVID around the world, as I've been researching for my next publication. And there have been artists whose work, the canvas is still wet to hang it at the fair, because the supply and demand is such for a lot of these artists that have been anointed, that the artists are now enslaved in a certain form of production, and the opportunity for them to develop or step back from the work and look at it over time isn't there. In addition to which, I'm noticing too that a lot of artists, unlike many of you, you know, we talk about artists and influence, the artists who have influenced, the ideas that have influenced us, the shoulders that many of us stand on in terms of those who have gone before us, who have inspired and guided us. And many of these artists, when you look at their work, you can see who some of the other artists or ideas that have influenced them. And when they talk about their art, unlike artists from previous generations, they don't talk about the fact that this particular artist influenced them. It's as if they woke up one morning and this is their idea. It's an original thought, it's original process. But if you are aware of the art history within the African American historical canon and the world historical canon, you can see where that linear aesthetic pedigree comes from. So this is a great big concern, as well as something that people do not talk about, which is that historically, there have always been two different markets under the umbrella of African-American artists. And one was the popular market, and one was the international market, which is based on the collective activity between artists and dealers and galleries and critics and collectors and appraisers and auction houses and everything. And there have been many years that there was also a divide between figurative artists and abstract artists, and whether it was which they would label one thing or another, you know, oh, that's Black art, and whereas one particular medium wasn't acceptable for some collectors and institutions. But these two markets are very distinct, and what's distinct about them is that the popular market, with many talented artists decided they were not waiting for the white infrastructure of the art world to validate them. They were going to make their work for themselves and strangers. They created their own markets, their own artist-related fairs. People supported their work. And for many years, they were making more money in that arena than many of the artists that were trying for years to get into the international marketplace. And then you had the market that we're seeing now, which is the international arena, where there are all of these different artists who are achieving great success, and artists who were not being taken as seriously as they should have in the 80s and 90s, but now that they are in their late 60s, 70s, and 80s, these institutions want to fill the historic and aesthetic gaps in these collections because many of their contemporaries are no longer alive, or the best of their work doesn't exist any longer, and they need to fill these historic and aesthetic gaps to continue to validate a period of art history. So there's a great disparity between the continuity that was so much a part of my generation. You know, you couldn't think about studying African-American artists and art history if you didn't go through a certain pecking order. If you were in New York, if you didn't go to the Hatch Billups collection and sit with Camille Billups, or if you didn't go to Kinkillaba House and sit with Corinne Jennings, if you didn't go to Bob Blackburn's printmaking workshop, if people didn't come to you, Curly, you know, through the experimental workshop, if people didn't, you know, meet or speak with anybody who was at a particular time at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and at that point it was Mary Schmidt Campbell or Lowry Sims, who was the only Black curator for years in any major institution at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And there was a sense of community and sharing of information and support. And this goes back to what Robin was saying, that these kinds of infrastructures for not only for artists, but art professionals has been diminished. And today's contemporary artists, interestingly enough, a lot of these younger artists, they're afraid to go to each other's studios and talk about aesthetics and the work and the world. And it's a concern. Are they gonna? Is there going to be another? Is it possible for there to ever be another spiral movement?
I don't,
you know,
Halima, I don't think most of them are prepared to have a serious conversation about aesthetics, to be honest with you. Another thing that Benny Andrews mentioned this in his interview, that there was an absence of African-American or Black critics to actually talk about African-American art. That's still present to this day.
That's right.
We don't have any critical confrontation. We don't, we do, you know, there are reviews, which are basically press releases. You don't have any judgment that's activated about the work so that it can sort it out. Everything is good, everything is okay if you get some attention. I'm a real big proponent of what we call critical confrontation. Challenge it, confront it, make it stand. I think that's important.
And that is so important, Curly, what you're saying. And in relationship to being an educator, I don't know how many of the younger artists who are really high profile artists are working in education, but I know that the three of us are very devoted to that. And it takes a tremendous amount of consideration to formulate the essential questions that you want your students to really reflect upon.
Absolutely.
And it takes a lot of grooming to get them to a point where they can argue. That is really the spice of society. It's something that I experienced the times that I went to Cuba, is that people are healthy in their arguing. They are respectful and engaging and inspired by really pointing out different viewpoints. And that is what really gets you to really extend and expand your vision and your understanding of the world, which is what we're supposed to be doing as artists. So the lack of this whole call and response and intergenerational exchange through education is really at a minimal now. And I think a lot of the self-editing that we witness is very painful too. You see people self-editing because they want to be celebrities or they want to be famous, which I'm not really sure what that fulfills within them. I don't really quite grasp onto that. But to go back to something that Adger continuously points out, is that there's a spiritual infrastructure that we all develop and that we check in with periodically as our life moves on, as we have different experiences, as our status in our family shifts, and as we get older. That really is the visceral direction for almost everything we do. And I'm wondering if the younger artists have the inclination or understanding that that's something that holds you together no matter what, that gives you that strength, that stamina, not only to continue being an artist in this country, which is very difficult. This is one of the most ignorant countries on the face of the planet when it comes to its own culture. I mean, it's just appalling. Right. I mean, you go to any country in Africa, Asia, Europe, or the Americas, and every person has some artwork by somebody. They've read a book, they go to the theater. But we have this American delusional, romantic, Hollywood type understanding of what success is, what being famous is, what having a lot of money is. And I know that at least for me, the biggest success is really feeling fulfilled, that I am able to realize a vision that I can barely capture. And that's what keeps me going. I mean, most of the reason I keep working is that I'm never satisfied with what I do. No matter how on point it is, by the time I finish it, I'm somewhere else.
Right.
So that whole reality of the creative, I can't even say the creative process, it's a creative life. It's a way of living. Right. So we see things in a particular way.
Yeah.
I was in Mexico.
Excuse me one moment. I'm sorry to have to interrupt this. This conversation is absolutely magnificent, but we have 3 questions in the chat, and we've gone over, which is easy for us to do. But Curly, please finish your point, and then afterwards, I'd like us to take the questions and answers from the questions.
I was studying in Oaxaca, Mexico, southern Mexico, and I had a chance to meet Francisco Toledo at a lunch. He's a very famous Mexican artist, and he looked at me and he asked me, during the introduction, what was my project. And I told him, well, I was in Mexico to look at the work of Rufino, Tamayo Rufino, Frida Kahlo. And he said, no, what is your project? And that's what Robin was talking about. What is your project? Right. That is what Adger talked about. But I also want to go back to some just briefly to say that these young artists, they act as if, and you mentioned this, they have no fathers. Adger mentioned Gordon Parks speaking to him. Mm-hmm. I know Robin was influenced by Bob Blackburn and others. So we have history, and we honor our maestros, and that they help set the stage for us. Young artists now, you will look at or listen to them and make no mention of anyone that they've studied with, as if they're their own creation.
Yep.
That's what I had to say. I'm done.
No, thank you. And thank you all for this really meaningful and substantive conversation. I wish we could continue, but we do have a certain time limit. So what is the first question? Let's see, I don't see where the questions are. Could Catherine, could you let us know what the questions are?
Yeah, sure. So if you go into the Q&A, it'll be under open questions.
Okay, okay, all right, thank you. What is the role of traditional art criticism for African-American artists today?
There is none.
Yeah, what are you talking about?
There is none. There is none.
Yeah.
You know, all these kids who are coming out of colleges who are being curators are coming out of Yale and Harvard, and they don't know anything other than what they've learned in school. They haven't visited any artists. They haven't talked to anybody. So what they get is school book training. And they come out and they all talk about the same thing. And they only talk about what's written. They study out of books, and then they formulate these concepts and ideas from reading books on artists, et cetera, et cetera. But they have no in the field work. They don't go to an artist and talk to him and find out what he's about. It's all out of books. That's one point. You know, I just want to say one mention quickly. Jazz music and jazz artists were my heroes. Bird, Diz, Miles Monk, Train, Mingus, you name it. They had rhythm, they had color, and they had form. And I tried to translate some of that.
And
very jazz music.
They had courage also.
Courage.
Yes. And I think that when you think about courage in relation to art criticism as it pertains to not only African American artists, the criticism of the work, but also critics, you know, it takes me back to James Porter, who, when he wrote the seminal book that established the field of African American art history and modern Negro art, the catalyst for that was him asking, why weren't any of the artists from the Harlem Renaissance written about by critics and getting critical acclaim? And at the time, he was told that those artists, Black artists in America, did not have a history for there to be any critique made. So that was the catalyst for him to end up saying, yeah, we exist, we have a history. And he wrote the first African American art history book in 1943. And then again, to support that work, of course, David Driscoll curated the exhibition, 2 Centuries of Black American Art, and had the catalog that accompanied it to say, yes, we have a history and we've been here for 200 years. And and then after that, Dr. Samela Lewis was the first African-American trained art historian who came out with her publication, Art African-American, I think a year after David Driscoll's seminal exhibition that traveled the world. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because of the fact that it's taking time, and there's a progression. And when it comes to African American art criticism, I think what's important is that in order to do that, you have to think critically, but there has to be an American art history that looks at the meritorious work of American artists of African descent with the same lens for quality and substance, instead of continuing to compartmentalize it into these market categories of Black art. Because all artists from all over the world are looking at art and artists from all over the world when they're being formally trained, or if they have various areas of interest. But yes, we need more writers to write critically and to think critically. The next question is, what advice would you give to a young aspiring artist who's a student? And I'd like all 3 of you to answer that.
I did a panel discussion with the Fashion Institute at Kent State University a few days ago for a student class. And I was asked the same question. And my answer was, You can't determine whether you will have opportunities in life, but you can determine whether you're prepared for them. So I say to these students is be prepared. Chance is attracted to a mind that's prepared. So yes, do the work, do the labor, put the 10,000 hours in and prepare yourself and it will come to you. I'm a firm believer in that. It will come.
You must believe, first of all, in yourself. If you don't believe whatever you are trying to be, nobody else is going to believe it. You know, I knew this guy used to walk around with a saxophone. He couldn't play it, but he walked around with it every day. And everybody asked him, what he said, oh, this is my horn. He didn't play it, but he's been inspired by it. He did something totally different. But the other thing for young people is stay the course. Stay the course. Stay the course. And believe in what it is you're doing.
Well, my advice is the same advice that my mom gave me when I was an adolescent. She said, you must get up off your butt and go find out what's going on in every situation. Who, why, what, when, where, and how. And you just keep following those questions. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? Where am I doing it? Who am I doing it for? Where did it come from? Sure. That's kind of like what I have followed my entire life, and it doesn't get easier. I mean, I don't see how these schools prepare these young people to be artists in the real world. They don't know anything about finances. They don't know anything about marketing. They do know about publicity. They do know about. They don't have too many skills that they've built. Research, find out, connect, ask questions. And get up off your butt and move around. Find out what other people are doing. Try to figure out and stop being so obsessed with being original. Because if you're living your life, your true life, you will be unique. But this kind of obsession to do something new and to do something original, I think sidetracks people from really discovering what they really have to offer, what their message is.
Mm-hmm. Travel, that's another important thing. Travel, go somewhere you've never been before and just look around. Just absorb something else. Travel is very important because it makes you deal with life in a different way. And you're going to get it all anyway. If you sit in one spot in your life, you're still going to get pain, joy, happiness, love. If you sit in one spot. So get out and move around, and you're going to get all that anyway, but you're also collecting. Rumi said an artist swims through the world like a whale, gathering everything, and then he comes back and digests it all. So you must experience the world. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. It's not to be afraid of.
Well, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining me this evening. Just a moment before we, I have a notice here. It says, I am an artist, Gustav Bloch. He was in the film, who was lucky enough to be in the film, and I have thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. I am too worried about the overcorrection of African-American artists thrust into the spotlight when it is so obvious the work prematurely credited with being great. I believe social media is accelerating the careers of so many artists, and the question was just, the rest of it was just removed. Thank you for commenting, Gustav.
Sorry, it's in the answered section. If you see there's open and answered, I was just making it public.
Oh, okay. So at this point, what I'd like to do is conclude this discussion reluctantly, but we are out of time. But I personally want to thank each and every one of you for joining me this evening, and sharing, such meaningful and truthful insights about your work and being an artist in this country. And also, I want to thank you for inspiring new artists and just everyone about the work, the process, and the experience that they can have by listening, reading, learning, looking, and exploring new and exciting things about themselves through the work that each of you and other artists produce. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Well.
Adjure.
Right, man.
All right. Take care, Robin.
Okay.
Bye, Robin. Bye, Curly.
Hello, everybody.
Bye. Bye.